My name is Günther Bischoff. I'm the chair of the University of New Orleans History Department and the director of Center Austria there. Steve Ambrose was one of my mentors and turned a young Austrian into half an American. And I've worked with Dr. Ambrose for many years at the beginning of the Eisenhower Center. So it's a privilege to be here. I was thinking to myself, having attended many an academic conference as a professional historian, usually conferences have quite a few dull papers and one or two exciting keynote speeches. But this conference is very unusual in the sense that we've heard only keynoters for 2 days now. And I think we're all feeling very fortunate to hear all these great minds at work. Just a brief note. On yesterday's sessions on the discourse about the Great War, I was thinking to myself, and it really came out fully in the afternoon session with Dr. Bartov, and also a bit with Anthony Beaver when they began talking about the memory of the war in Germany. That is really one context that should be applied to the American debate on the good war too. Namely, the good war, I think, is a specific American memory regime that came to develop in the 1980s and into the 1990s for different reasons. But Americans didn't always think about World War II as a good war. They didn't right after the war when the soldiers came home and had very conflicted memories about the war. They didn't when what I would call memory went into hibernation for almost a generation until the 1980s, when the soldiers got on with their busy lives, started families, and didn't think much about the war, or if they had bad memories and nightmares, they wanted to suppress it. And as Dr. Bartov said, the Holocaust was not a big theme in German schools in the 60s and 70s, but as we know from Peter Novik's book, it wasn't in the United States either. So I would like to advocate to think about the good war as a specific regime the American thought about the war, and one paradigm, I would argue, that is under discussion again, whether indeed it is the appropriate term. Now about this session, when we began putting together this program 2 years ago, and I was on the program committee from the beginning, we actually had two different sessions, namely one on the Holocaust and atrocities, and a different one on prisoners of war. And when Katrina blew away our first grand conference program and we had to begin reducing it, unfortunately the POW panel is one that fell by the wayside, or you could also say that those two sessions were really telescoped into one, the one we're going to hear this morning. Now, we're talking about the Holocaust and genocide this morning, about atrocities being committed on all battlefronts by all armies, and POW mistreatment. I think all of these things by definition question the good war paradigm, the good war almost being a contradiction in terms. And these are the issues we want to continue debating this morning. How could humanity slip so low in the course of World War II? Or put more bluntly, we discussed this yesterday too, how could the Germans, who were known as das Volk der Dichter und Denker, the people of the great minds and the great thinkers, become das Volk der Mörder und Henker, the people of murderers and hangmen? That indeed is a weighty question. What was the context of the final solution and the genocidal actions? How could the wars on both Eastern Front in the Pacific and the war against the Soviet Union become essentially wars of annihilation? How could millions of civilians become victims of war and bombing and also as forced laborers? How could not only ordinary Germans but also ordinary Americans slip into committing atrocities in this war and in the process go through a process of dehumanization? Obviously, we cannot answer all of these questions this morning, but at least I hope we can come up with some suggestions to answer these questions. Now we have a very distinguished panel up here. I'm going to introduce them all and then sit down. We decided, given that Professor Bartov has a very broad topic, namely genocide as a leitmotif of 20th century history, he's going to go first, and then Dr. Weingartner, and then Dr. Tenney Dr. Weingartner talking about atrocities being ubiquitous in World War II, and Dr. Tenney representing here the POW story as one who has survived the Bataan Death March and been in Japanese POW camps for 3 years. We already heard Dr. Bartov being introduced, Brown University now, a very distinguished historian of the Holocaust, one of the best ones, I would argue. I just want to briefly tell you how I encountered him. I was a young graduate student, or not so young anymore, at Harvard University at the Center for European Studies, and we had a conference there, and the great military historian John Keegan came in with a very young fellow who happened to be Omar Bartov, just finishing his PhD at Oxford, writing on the Eastern Front, and introduced him as the best young historian of World War II. And I think Omar Bartov has lived up to that billing. I usually assign in my World War II class, which I started out teaching with Dr. Ambrose together, we also used his book on Hitler's army, which I still think is the best, most concise, small volume on the German soldiers in the East. We discussed the Wehrmachtsausstellung, or he brought it up yesterday, the exhibit that went through the German and Austrian lands in the 1990s about the crimes committed by the German Wehrmacht. And I would argue that this book considerably came before the Wehrmachtsausstellung and already began to introduce those very important subject matters to the larger public. So that is a very fine book indeed. Dr. Weingartner I first encountered at another time as a graduate student earlier, when I wrote a paper on McCarthyism, or actually my master's thesis at the University of Innsbruck on McCarthyism. And some of you might know that Mark McCarthy also got involved in the controversy in 1948 over the Malmedy massacre. And of course, Dr. Weingartner is the expert on the Malmedy massacre happening in the course of the Battle of the Bulge, has written about that ever since, but as you'll hear this morning, has also written about American atrocities being committed in various theaters of war. Dr. Tenney, academic himself, later on after he survived his horrific experience in World War II POW camps, wrote a book about his experience, My Hitch in Hell, and he is also involved in that movement by American POWs to get restitution from the Japanese government for the work they did for various Japanese corporations during World War II as essentially forced laborers. And that made me thinking this morning, my own father, who fought in the German Wehrmacht as a young soldier after Austria was taken over, became an American POW at the end of the war and worked for was a POW for a year at Camp Carson in Colorado Springs. And I always told him, having researched these issues, that he was a very lucky man indeed to end up a POW in American hands and not in the Rhine Meadow camps, but rather come to the United States, where he would be harvesting sugar beets for Colorado farmers. I was also thinking he's no longer with us. Interesting question indeed, if there were still some Colorado farmers that you could ask for restitution for your work. Anyway, I'm glad you're all here, and I'm going to ask Dr. Bartov to come up to the podium here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning to you all. The idea that the Holocaust was a central event of the 20th century has emerged only in the last 2 decades. Conversely, the term genocide was internationally recognized in 1948 as an attempt to define the increasingly widespread, wholesale, and indiscriminate killing of specifically targeted populations. The mass murder of the Jews was seen as merely one manifestation of genocide. Why did it take so long to recognize the historical centrality of the Holocaust? And why is it that as soon as it was acknowledged, critics began to speak of an overemphasis on the genocide of the Jews that allegedly marginalizes other atrocities, obscures the crimes of imperialism and post-colonialism, and privileges Jewish victims over the rest of suffering humanity. Such criticism is precisely the consequence of the fact that for several decades after 1945, the Holocaust hardly featured even as a crucial event in the war itself. Hence, this new focus seems to displace other historical protagonists and to empower the Jews as unique historical victims. To be sure, the absence of the Holocaust from the non-Jewish post-war historical consciousness was itself partly the product of anti-Semitic prejudice, repression of complicity in genocide, and nationalist and communist ideological requirements. But today's critics of the Holocaust's supposed public omnipresence attribute its rediscovery to contemporary capitalist and neo-colonialist ideological needs. The question remains, was the Holocaust a breakdown of civilization, or was it a mere manifestation of ongoing socio-cultural fractures? And what are the implications of asserting or rejecting its historical centrality? We should recall that when the exiled Jewish-Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide, he was thinking first and foremost of the Shoah. The lack of an appropriate term to describe this type of crime against humanity became clear at the Nuremberg Tribunal. Yet while it served as the incentive for defining genocide, the Holocaust disappeared as a major event for several decades. Similarly, the crucial discovery of genocide as a term, of course, was largely forgotten, both because the term was used too loosely and because the act itself became so prevalent. And when a new recognition of the centrality of genocide and the Holocaust finally emerged in the 1990s, they found themselves in competition with each other. How is it that the phenomenon, which had just been identified, defined, and named, simultaneously kept happening and remained unseen? In part, this was because the victims of genocide were so often voiceless. The early post-war era was concerned with the ideological split between capitalism and communism, definitions of fascism and totalitarianism, and the painful process of decolonization. This left little room for victims of crimes against humanity in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. For their part, the survivors of the Holocaust were rendered voiceless by their inability to express their trauma, the reluctance of post-war society to hear about their experience, and their desperate desire to reintegrate into their pre-war societies or to be accepted into new ones. Silence came to be viewed as a precondition of normalization. Changing political and ideological realities also led to the rediscovery of genocide and the Holocaust as central phenomena of the century. First, the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 played a crucial role in Jewish perceptions of the Holocaust. Second, the mass killings generated by the East-West conflict belied the solemn vows of never again made with the fall of Nazism. Finally, the end of the Cold War ushered in ethnic and religious conflicts deeply rooted in the unresolved legacy of the past. Liberation from the straitjacket of the Cold War facilitated knowledge and awareness of past genocides that provided a context for present atrocities. Yet focus on the past also diverted attention from crimes that could still be stopped. Indeed, a growing obsession with the concept and history of genocide was accompanied by a proliferation of actual genocides. Talking about the past eased the consciences of those unwilling to intervene in ongoing massacres. Between the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1993 and the establishment of the Task Force for International Cooperation and Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research in Stockholm in 1998, 1 million Bosnians and Rwandans were murdered with complete impunity. The rediscovery of past genocide also revealed some previously unacknowledged links. When Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, most Western scholars missed her argument that totalitarianism traced its roots to imperialism. This insight has been recently recovered, especially regarding the links between European policies of enslavement, ethnic cleansing, and genocide in Africa, and their subsequent importation into Europe, or their bloody African legacy as in Rwanda. Finally, recent scholarship has also recognized that the collapse of the great multi-ethnic empires in World War I greatly exacerbated ethnic conflicts in Europe's eastern borderlands, culminating in large-scale ethnic cleansing and genocide in World War II. This was the case, for instance, in the territories of Poland and Ukraine, where the Jews were murdered, the Ukrainians and Poles carried out mutual ethnic cleansing, and the occupying powers drastically redrew the borders. Such population policies were both at the root of the last century's violence and eradicated some of its causes by creating ethnically homogeneous societies. To some extent, we can say that the emerging nation-state, racial state, or totalitarian state became dedicated to defining enemies and targeting victims. Under conditions of total war, this process could and did unleash unprecedented state-directed violence. But the centrality of the Holocaust to 20th century violence is also related specifically to European perceptions of the Jews. For here was a category of people seen as the harbingers of modernity and as anachronistic medieval remnants, as the progenitors of the nation-state and as obstacles to its ethnic homogeneity, as the inventors of capitalism and as agents of communism, as a nation unto itself and as disruptive cosmopolitans, as racially exclusive and as polluters of other races. Simply put, the Jews came to incarnate all evils of modernity without shedding their demonic pre-modern stigma. The idea of race as a central obsession of early 20th century natural and social scientists and a leitmotif of much public discourse, or rather, this idea was a central leitmotif of public discourse. And Nazism was, of course, based on a racist ideology, at whose center was a demonic Jewish anti-race. It thus seems self-evident that the Holocaust was directly related to racism. Yet Nazi racism was far less consistent than the policy of exterminating the Jews. Gypsies were not pursued with the same determination. Slavs could be Untermenschen, subhumans, worthy of decimation, or useful subjects and collaborators, or allies. Hitler's regime even abandoned the term anti-Semitism so as not to offend Arab allies. Thus, the regime's obsession with the Jews far transcended its racist ideology. Similarly, it has been argued that the Jews were only one of several groups threatened by the regime's domestic eugenic policies, such as against homosexuals, the handicapped, even women. In fact, homosexuals were never pursued with the same vigor, and the pursuit of homosexuals concerned only German, Aryan, so to speak, homosexuals. The euthanasia campaign confronted growing criticism, and Nazi gender policies were hardly genocidal. Nevertheless, the racist ideological context of the Holocaust remains crucial, not least because it exposes the decisive contribution to genocide by the medical and legal elite. This in turn modifies the view that the Holocaust originated merely in traditional anti-Judaism. While racism has persisted after 1945, Nazi crime severely undermined its legitimacy as a scientific concept and a socially respectable term. At the same time, the early post-war decades tended to ignore the links between the genocide of the Jews and racial hygiene, persecution of gypsies and homosexuals, and state, NATO, and abortion policies, all of which continued after the war. Conversely, even as these links have come to be recognized in the last few decades, scientific racism, in the form of biological determinism, has also experienced a revival, just as ideological racism has returned under the guise of allegedly irreconcilable cultural, religious, or social differences. The strange path of racism can also be observed in the case of anti-Semitism. There is little doubt that Jewish emancipation and assimilation in the 19th century was closely linked to the appearance of modern anti-Semitism. There has been less agreement about the nature of the relationship between anti-Semitism and the emergence of Nazism. For many decades, historians dismissed the role of anti-Semitism as a main motivation for support of Nazism and participation in genocide. Instead, such impulses as anti-modernism, economic resentment, xenophobia, opportunism, peer pressure, greed, and fear of punishment were stressed. More recently, scholars have paid greater attention to anti-Semitism, both as an important motivating factor in the Holocaust and as a persistent post-war sentiment. To be sure, the Holocaust discredited public manifestations of anti-Semitism in Western Europe and the United States, though much less so in the communist bloc, Latin America, and the Arab world. But the recent renewed emphasis on the role of anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology and policies has coincided with the reappearance of anti-Semitic rhetoric in the West, often disguised as criticism of Israeli policies. Manifestations of anti-Semitism in the form of desecration of Jewish cemeteries, sorry, burning down of synagogues or attacking Jews on the street have been accompanied by anti-Israeli actions such as boycotts of Israeli scholars and students and academically sponsored divestment campaigns. Condemnations of the 9/11 attacks on the United States have at times come together with expressions of sympathy for Palestinian suicide bombers. Israeli military actions have often been compared, particularly in the European press, to Nazi policies, with the Palestinians playing the role of the Jews in the Holocaust. Israeli politicians have been portrayed with features reminiscent of cartoons in Der Stürmer, in the Nazi propaganda sheet. Jewish lobbies are alleged to control US policies, finances, and the media. Such arguments have a long pedigree. Polish anti-Semitic policies in 1968 were justified as an anti-Zionist reaction to Israeli aggression. Endemic anti-Semitism in the European left found similar expressions during the Lebanon War of 1982. As in the past, otherwise opposing camps united over the alleged Jewish threat. The scene has been further complicated by the expansion of Muslim populations in Europe, largely marginalized by their Christian co-citizens, yet numerically powerful enough to compel attention by different political parties. Among radicalized elements in these European Muslim populations, one finds a tendency to express anti-Israeli sentiments through anti-Semitic acts against their Jewish neighbors. These developments are accompanied by the increasingly prevalent argument that the recent focus on the Holocaust is part of a Jewish conspiracy to monopolize suffering, to extort money and legitimize power at the cost of others. This monopoly of suffering is said to be used to justify the persecution of the Palestinians just as much as to legitimize Jewish dominance, especially in the United States. The so-called Holocaust industry is supposedly shaking down Swiss banks and threatening to rob poor Polish peasants of their few possessions. The aftermath of 9/11 has seen a dramatic expansion of anti-Americanism, both in Europe and in much of the rest of the world, especially in Arab and Islamic countries. And anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism are often linked together in people's minds. Ironically, just as the Holocaust has been recognized as a leitmotif in our time, allegations about the insidious link between American imperialism and Jewish dominance are expressed more openly than at any time since Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign in the early 1950s. As Egyptian and Syrian soap operas reenact Jewish blood sacrifice, myths about the role of the Israeli Secret Service in the attacks on the World Trade Center have gained tremendous popularity in Arab and Islamic lands and in some circles in Europe. Meanwhile, claims in Europe and in liberal circles in the United States that the attacks of 9/11 were motivated by American support for Israel have been followed by allegations that American attacks on Afghanistan and Iraq were carried out in the service of Israeli Jewish interests. The emergence of the Holocaust in Western scholarship and intellectual discourse as a leitmotif of the previous century has thus been accompanied by a revival of its most pernicious underlying causes. The new century has already manifested much of the hate, prejudice, violence, and destruction that originated genocide in the previous fin de siècle. From this perspective, we may want to speak of a long 20th century that began with the ethnic massacres in the Balkans before World War I and ended with the attacks of September 11, 2001. These attacks may have changed the world in ways that can still not be predicted, but they are also reminiscent of the violence that preceded the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo and the mayhem of total war that followed it. Let us remember that the decade of optimism following the fall of communism was distinguished by the mass killing in Bosnia and Rwanda, whose savagery can only be compared to the Nazi genocide. This brings to mind another aspect of mass violence that has recently come to the fore: the relationship between intimacy and murder. We saw this already during the massacres and mass rape campaign in Bosnia, and even more vividly in the Rwandan genocide. A vivid reconstruction of one such event during the Holocaust was provided in Jan Gross's recent study, Neighbors, depicting the massacre of the Jews of the town of Jedwabne by their own Polish neighbors in the summer of 1941. Here is one of the paradoxes of human civilization and one of its greatest challenges. How do we explain the eruption of deadly violence between neighbors? What makes people who have lived in close proximity for many generations, who depend on each other in many other respects, to turn on each other with the kind of savagery that only intimacy can seemingly unleash? Such instances of intimate massacre occurred many times in the past. In 1904 in German Southwest Africa, in 1915 in the Ottoman Empire, during the Greek-Turkish conflict in the wake of World War I, in the persecution of the Gypsies by their neighbors and the abandonment of the handicapped by their families during the Third Reich, and of course in the Holocaust. The twice converted and deeply assimilated Viktor Klemperer reported in his diary how most of his colleagues and friends condemned German Jews to social death long before their deportation. Hedda Margolius Kowali wrote eloquently about her double abandonment by fellow citizens in Prague, once when she escaped the Nazis and once when her husband was executed by Stalin's henchmen. The Holocaust saw endless examples of communal slaughter. Open-air massacres of Jews by a combination of German officials, local militias, and enthusiastic residents were a common occurrence in Eastern Europe. While half of the victims died in death factories, much of the rest were murdered in public view of their neighbors and often with their active participation. Some neighbors rescued Jews, some denounced them, some participated avidly in the killing. Most neighbors, colleagues, friends, and schoolmates just stood by and looked on. Similar scenes and patterns of behavior were seen decades later in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. So what does this teach us about pluralism, interethnic relations, or human nature? If we wish to consider the Holocaust as a leitmotif of the 20th century, we can say that some of the prejudices, dangers, misconceptions, and triggers of violence that were present then are still with us today. They may look different, come from other sources, beliefs, and politics, but they share some similarities. The notion that one learns from an atrocity should not be discarded, but one of the most important lessons must be that learning about atrocities does not prevent their recurrence. On the contrary, as the number and scale of atrocities, genocides, and destructive impulses multiplies, our belief in progress, modernization, education, and social mobility diminishes, we must think of this leitmotif not only as a key to understanding the past, but also as a warning about the future. Thank you.
As I was thinking about my remarks for this morning, I remembered an American Historical Association convention of about 15 years ago. One of the sessions that I attended had something to do with World War II war crimes, and one of the speakers, and in fact it was Professor Bartov, spoke about German atrocities in Russia, including the mass slaughter by the Germans of Russian POWs. During the question session that followed, a somewhat rough-hewn gentleman in a plaid shirt sitting a few rows ahead of me raised his hand and after introducing himself as Steve Ambrose, said something to the effect that everybody killed prisoners of war. The implication being perhaps, so what was the big deal? Although I suspect that Ambrose was attempting to be provocative because he certainly recognized that the German record in Russia was particularly atrocious. Of course, Ambrose was right. All participating nations did, to varying degrees and for various reasons, kill prisoners and commit other violations of the laws of war. But World War II confronts us with a wide range of atrocities, and it's important not to blur important distinctions. German genocide, as we've heard referred to on a number of occasions in this conference, the Japanese mass murders of Chinese, the extermination of thousands of Polish officers by the Soviet Union. And the list is by no means exhaustive, are in different categories from the smaller scale and often spontaneous battlefield atrocities of which all the warring nations were guilty, and on which I'm going to focus this morning. I'll use as my point of departure an excerpt from a letter written by then Lieutenant General George S. Patton to his wife Beatrice on April 4th, 1944. Patton wrote, "Some fair-haired boys are trying to say that I killed too many prisoners. Yet, the same people cheer at the far greater killing of Japs. Well, the more I killed, the fewer men I lost. But they don't think of that. Sometimes I think that I will quit and join a monastery." Well, old Blood and Guts didn't morph into Brother George. He had written the letter the day before he was to be questioned by a representative of the Army's Inspector General's Department regarding his responsibility in the killing of about 75 Axis prisoners of war near Biscari, Sicily, by troops of the 45th Infantry Division in the previous July of 1943, of course. He assured the Inspector General's representative of his innocence, but of course that assurance had been contradicted not only by his letter to his wife of the day before, but by much evidence suggesting that prior to the invasion of Sicily, Patton had discouraged the taking of prisoners. "We will get the name of killers," Patton is alleged to have said in an address to his troops, "and killers are immortal. When word reaches the enemy that he is faced by a killer outfit, he will fight less." One officer quoted Patton as having argued against the taking of prisoners on the grounds that the more we took, the more we'd have to feed. Not surprisingly, some officers and men concluded that they had a free hand to kill Axis troops who had surrendered. One GI condensed Patton's ramblings into a typically blunt GI, "Fuck them, no prisoners." Patton's bloody rhetoric had seemingly encouraged the kind of brutality that frequently results spontaneously from the rage, confusion, and terror of combat. Some GIs reported that Italian troops had fired at U.S. medics and the wounded that they were tending, therefore justifying in the minds of the GIs the summary execution of prisoners. And one GI claimed to have witnessed the killing of 2 surrendered Americans by the enemy. This was a common war crime scenario. Atrocities were commonly justified in the minds of perpetrators on both sides, with varying degrees of plausibility, as reprisals for prior atrocities inflicted on them. Although sometimes they were committed simply as retribution for the deaths of comrades in battle. Sometimes prisoners were killed because of the unwillingness of their captors to permit them the relative security of captivity, while they themselves remained exposed to the hazards of battle. Sometimes prisoners were killed for the purely utilitarian reason that it was impractical or inconvenient to keep them, or out of frustration over a war that was going badly, or was being unnecessarily prolonged by the enemy. Extreme stress, physical discomfort, sleep deprivation, not to mention the destructive impulses of adolescent males, were probably often contributing factors. The casual murder of prisoners was commonplace, even when it was not openly encouraged by commanders or by ideologies that dehumanized the enemy or glorified brutality. Far better known to Americans than Biscari is an incident that occurred about a year and a half later at a road junction south of the Belgian town of Malmedy. Here on December 17, 1944, somewhere in the vicinity of 80 surrendered U.S. soldiers, and the numbers have always been a little uncertain, were gunned down by Waffen-SS troops who were spearheading the German Ardennes offensive that created what is known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. Operations had been preceded by pre-attack pep talks, urging the creation of a wave of fright and terror, and highly ambiguous directives not to worry about the taking of prisoners. The SS men were also encouraged to regard the offensive as an opportunity to wreak vengeance on Americans for the bombing raids that had cost the lives of many thousands of German civilians. Word of the Malmedy massacre quickly circulated among U.S. forces, and the cycle of atrocity as reprisal for atrocity continued in the form of a marked disinclination to make prisoners of Waffen-SS troops, whose reputation for killing Western POWs reached back to the German invasion of France and the Low Countries in 1940. Their reputation for brutality in the West had been enhanced 6 months earlier by the mass murder of over 600 French civilians men, women, and children at Oradour-sur-Glane by troops of the 2nd SS Panzer Division as they moved to the Normandy front. An example of the horrific and indiscriminate reprisals often taken by Germans for guerrilla resistance. The Normandy massacre lingers in the American memory as an example both of the sacrifice made by U.S. servicemen in defeating the Axis and of German depravity. A poorly informed U.S. senator, and it is Joe McCarthy, by the way, proclaimed in 1949 that, quote, "there is nothing that any of us can recall in recorded history that approaches the unwarranted type of mass slaughter that occurred at Normandy." But GIs who had liberated Nazi concentration camps knew better, including troops, once again, of the 45th Infantry Division, who, after capturing Dachau on April 29, 1945, and finding boxcars filled with emaciated corpses, machine guns surrendered SS men with rather better reason than they had had for the murders at Biscari. In the latter stages of the war, Allied airmen were at considerable risk if they were shot down over German territory, and many were murdered after capture. These crimes were the products of German rage and desperation over Allied bombing and were actively encouraged by the Nazi regime. An editorial by Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels of May 29, 1944, excused the killing of captured Allied aircrew as the treating of child murderers as they deserve. Not surprisingly, the Allies disagreed, and the murders of U.S. and British aircrew were the focus of multiple war crimes trials held after the war, actually about 200 of them. One of these trials dealt with an incident that occurred on the North Sea island of Borkum on August 4, 1944. An 8th Air Force B-17 had been damaged during operations over northern Germany and crash-landed on the island. The crewmen were marched through the village of Borkum, where they were beaten by townspeople who had been encouraged to violence by the mayor. The airmen were then shot to death by an off-duty member of the Wehrmacht who shouted as he fired that his wife and children had been killed in an air raid on Hamburg. 14 Germans were convicted of the atrocity by a U.S. Army court, and 3 were eventually executed. But the attorney representing one of those Germans hanged complained bitterly to U.S. authorities about the double standard implied by the release of a former U.S. Army lieutenant after having served 3 years of a 25-year sentence imposed by a U.S. Army court-martial for the unprovoked murder of at least 4 and probably 8 German civilians, including 2 women, in the final weeks of the war. The young officer believed that he had been authorized by his battalion commander to kill Krauts, and that all Germans, civilians as well as combatants, were legitimate targets. The attorney might have reflected on the fact that the American lieutenant had at least been tried by the U.S. Army, if perhaps inadequately punished, which, by the way, was an opinion shared by a mellower George Patton, while neither German military nor civilian authorities had made any effort to apprehend or punish those responsible for the Borkum murders. Let's return momentarily to Biscari and Malmedy. Remember Patton's annoyance that unidentified fair-haired boys were criticizing him for the killing of European Axis POWs, but also hypocritically cheering, as he put it, at the far greater killing of Japs. In the course of the Malmedy Massacre war crimes trial in 1946, an ex-Waffen-SS officer turned prosecution witness testified that the commander of the battle group responsible for the massacre had declared prior to the offensive that, quote, "We will fight in the same manner as we did in Russia. The rules which have applied in the West until now will be omitted." Both statements refer to what every student of World War II knows, that war in the East, whether Eastern Europe or Asia, was very much nastier than war in the West, as brutal as that could be. The East was another universe, with its own rules or no rules. Russian prisoners and civilians who died at the hands of the Germans in their millions were victims of a Nazi racial ideology that branded Jews, Slavs, and other ethnic groups, as we've heard recently, as subhumans whom Germans might freely murder. And freely murdered they were. Russian treatment of Germans as brutal aggressors and ideological subhumans, fascist beasts, was often comparable. In the East, malmedies and hors d'oeuvres were commonplace. And here, German genocidal policies and the brutal dynamics of the battlefield were intertwined. But the United States had its own subhuman enemy in the Japanese, and we've heard reference to this from time to time throughout this conference. Marines, one American observer noted, did not consider they were killing men. They were wiping out dirty animals. It was just a natural feeling that developed elementally, a Marine Corps veteran recalled in trying to explain his hatred of the Japanese. But a U.S. Army veteran of fighting in the Pacific remembered that we had been fed tales of these yellow thugs, subhumans, with teeth that resembled fangs. If 100,000 Japs were killed, so much the better. 200,000, even better. I wasn't innocent either. You couldn't escape it. Some War Department training literature depicted the Japanese in terms not dissimilar from the dehumanizing imagery that Germans applied to Russians. Japanese soldiers were likened to poisonous snakes, and GIs were urged to use their better brains in combating them. They were told that Japanese could be detected by their odor, described as the gamey smell of animals, appropriate for an enemy commonly represented pictorially as apes or monkeys. Although well treated in U.S. POW camps, vastly better than the notoriously brutal treatment meted out by the Japanese to their prisoners, who were despised for their willingness to surrender, there were relatively few Japanese prisoners to begin with. In large part, this was due to the expectation of the Japanese High Command that Japanese soldiers fight to the death, and to the overwhelming U.S. firepower that was brought against them, but not entirely. While serving as a technical advisor in the Pacific, Charles Lindbergh was told by a U.S. Army officer on New Guinea, "Oh, we could take more prisoners if we wanted to, but our boys don't like to take prisoners." It doesn't encourage the rest to surrender, Lindbergh continued, when they hear of their buddies marched out on the flying field and machine guns turned loose on them. A Marine Corps veteran of the fighting on Okinawa remembers 9 Marines in 10 would shoot them. If you saw a Jap trying to surrender, you'd let him have it fast. While a no-quarter attitude might be understandable, given horrendous Japanese crimes, as in the infamous Bataan Death March, about which we'll hear in a moment, the beheading of downed American flyers, widespread reports of Japanese feigning surrender only to attack their off-guard captors. Although it's interesting to note that Germans leveled the same kinds of accusations against Russians. It's clear, too, that a popular racism sharpened by the attack on Pearl Harbor and reinforced by indoctrination as well as by often atrocious Japanese conduct, had dehumanized Japanese in the minds of many American combatants. This was gruesomely reflected in the common practice of collecting Japanese body parts by some U.S. servicemen as grisly trophies of war. The importation by GIs into the United States of skulls, artifacts made from other bones, one of which, by the way, was presented to President Roosevelt, as well as ears, noses, and the always popular gold teeth, became common enough to attract the attention of the U.S. Customs Service and Japanese propagandists who hypocritically offered it as evidence of the beastly nature of Americans. So Ambrose was right. Everybody was guilty of battlefield atrocities. In the aftermath of post-war trials and convictions of Germans accused of murdering POWs, some Western Allied commanders suffered from uneasy consciences in the knowledge that their own troops had committed similar offenses but had not faced punishment. Canadian General Chris Vokes, while considering a plea for clemency by Kurt Meyer, former commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, who had been sentenced to death for the murder of Canadian POWs in Normandy, observed, quote, "There isn't a general or colonel on the Allied side that I know of who hasn't said, well, this time we don't want any prisoners." Some atrocities were simply the products of the psychological environment of the battlefield that probably affected all participants in approximately similar ways. Although criminal behavior obviously could be influenced and was by ideological and factors and ethnic differences. The U.S. War Department's Bureau of Public Relations urged that the Biscari case be kept secret on the grounds that, quote, "it would arouse a segment of our own citizens who are so distant from combat that they do not understand the savagery that is war." But atrocities such as the Biscari and Malmedy massacres were qualitatively different from killings carried out in vastly greater numbers as a matter of official policy. A few United States commanders and officials did speak rhetorically of the need to exterminate the Japanese people, but of course racial extermination never came close to becoming official policy, as it did become official policy, of course, in Germany. And the collection of Japanese body parts as souvenirs was condemned by the U.S. State Department and military as the violation of international law and common decency that it was. Recognition of the ubiquity of atrocities on World War II battlefields, therefore, should not be misconstrued. And I'll say that again. Recognition of the ubiquity of atrocities on World War II battlefields, therefore, should should not be misconstrued as evidence of the moral equivalence of the parties to history's most destructive war. But combat is an extreme experience in which the laws of war often seem irrelevant. And even the good guys sometimes do bad things. Thank you.
Good morning. One of the nice things about being the last on the program is those who came in late that didn't want us get up too early, they're still here. That's a good idea. When I first agreed to come here and speak, I prepared what I thought would be the response that is expected. And then I started to hear things that had been said during the program, and it sort of changes my concept of what I wanted to say in general. But the program said that it's a veteran's perspective is what I'm going to be talking about. That is my point of view. And so with my point of view in mind, I would like to start by saying that during the war years, most of the American people became very fascinated with the European part of the war and very little knew or any care about the Pacific part. Now, as my perspective in this comes about, is because we have relatives and we have inheritance from people in parts of Europe. We have family that came from Germany, from France, from England, from Poland, from Russia. And so during the war years, when you heard about a battle in a certain part of Europe, you will right away be able to generate thoughts about how the family was related to that. But how many during the war years had family in Saipan, the Mariana Islands, the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa, Okinawa? We didn't have family there. We didn't have a relationship, and so we didn't think too much about it. Think about it today. As I walk through the park back there where all the books are, take a look at how many books are on European war and how many are on the Pacific War. Very few. Take a look at the museum here. It's called the World War II Museum D-Day. D-Day. Not the end of the war, but D-Day. So we have always been thinking about the war in that respect. Now, prisoners of war are in a very vulnerable situation as they are at the mercy of their captors, and they are beyond reach of their own government. The force of arms cannot protect them any longer, and the force of law relies on reciprocal, consensual regime of understanding among the combatants. The vulnerability of prisoners of war can be lessened by the principles of international law and the usage thereof, for which there is to be expected from a civilized nation. Those captured by the Germans benefited from these international understandings. Those captured by the Japanese suffered tremendously from the absence of humanitarian efforts of a civilized nation, which would come from the international understandings of right and wrong. We tried to figure out what happened. I was asked just this last night, why were the Japanese so cruel to the prisoners? Well, try to understand this as a person in the war. 1 hour before I was captured, I was trying to kill them. And that's true with all prisoners of war. Before we were captured, we were trying to kill them. And in many cases, we may have killed their buddy or their brother standing next to them 1 hour earlier. So obviously, they're not really excited about capturing us. So keep that in mind. Number two, keep in mind that when we captured or when we were able to get into a Japanese area during the fighting on Bataan, our fighting started December 7th, ended April 9th. During that period of time on Bataan, our main objective was to keep the Japanese into one line. And every so often the Japanese would come down and we would have to try to push up. And then we would be able to isolate 4 or 5 Japanese soldiers. We wanted to capture them. After 1 or 2 tries, you realize that's useless, because that Japanese soldier lying on the ground bleeding that you're ready to capture is ready to throw a hand grenade right at you because he does not want to be captured, because he believes that death is better than capture. When I made that first march into my first prison camp, O'Donnell, and I stood there listening to the Japanese officer as he paraded back and forth about how bad we were, he was emphatic when he said, "You are lower than dogs. You are cowards. You surrendered. Japanese would never surrender." That was his motive of sharing with us how he felt about we prisoners of war. Well, if I'm giving the impression of anger, It is only anger from the many years ago that happened. Today, we look at the nation a little different than we ever looked at them before, Japan and its people. So I no longer feel any animosity towards the Japanese. I would like to share with you a few thoughts as a point of view. My point of view is about Bataan and what happened on Bataan. I can assure you is the same point of view of almost all 12,000 Americans that were captured. So I share with you not one point of view, but almost all of us. From the day we were captured, we all suffered the same consequences. What we saw may have been a little different. On the march, on the fourth day on the march, without food, without water, a Japanese came by on horseback, swinging his samurai sword, trying to cut off a neck here and there. Well, he missed my neck, but he slit me down the back. My boyfriend picked me up and carried me and brought up a medic from the back to sew me up. So what that man did to me and what others saw, all my other friends saw. Maybe they didn't see me, but they saw somebody else that had the same treatment. When I saw an American lying on the ground and the Japanese said, "Get up," and he said, "I can't get up," it was impossible for him to get up. He called 3 other Americans out and had them dig a hole. And he said, "Put that man in that hole," and my friend said, "I can't, he's still breathing." The Japanese shot one of them, called 2 more men and said, "Dig 3 holes. Who else doesn't want to bury that man?" I saw that, but hundreds of others saw the same thing. These are the atrocities that we saw. But what I saw is what they all saw. Yesterday, I filled in a little for Mel Rosen, who was supposed to be on the program. He was a colleague of mine who was in the Bataan Death March. Mel's difference in the entire program was that in his being taken to Japan aboard hell ships, Mel was on 3 different hell ships. Each one of them was torpedoed and sunk, and he swam to shore and was on a second one and then on the third one until he finally got to Japan. So I shared some ideas with you at that time. But I want to share with you the fact that the Japanese soldiers honored the Bushido Code of Conduct, where a person is elevated over the Creator himself. And the concept of this is the preoccupation with death rather than with life. The samurai's great concern was how to die for the emperor, for the glory of his master, while we Americans worked hard to please our Creator by performing good deeds during our lifetime. Well, this philosophy of the Japanese soldier, that death is better than capture or living, actually is what was the nail in our coffin. You see, fighting the enemy who wishes for death in order to be victorious made fighting them very difficult and living with them almost impossible. Interesting to note, if you take a look at prisoners of war in general, take a look at the European prisoners of war and the Japanese, in other words, the American former prisoners of war. Those who were captured by the Germans were taken into, usually in small groups, 1, 2, 5, or 10 were surrounded. They realized that they had no place to go, their guns jammed, or they had the German soldiers around them, and so the Americans said, "I have to surrender." And the Germans treated them very nice. They took them into camp. If they were injured, they took them to a doctor. In prison, 1.2% of those Americans captured by the Germans were killed or died in prison camp. 1.2%. Of those captured by the Japanese, 40.1% died while a prisoner of war. Now, those are tremendous differences, 1.2. There's a saying that you had a greater chance of surviving if you were on a battlefield fighting the Japanese than you were if you were in a prison camp. the view of a former POW, the view of the mental and psychological problems, the surviving, what we had to survive and coming home. These are seeds that we have to think about. I wrote some comments down as I was listening, and I just want to share them if I can at this moment. Number one, we had a problem in Japan, prison camp, with the Jewish issue. We had a young man, we were all young men, a fellow by the name of Friedman, Bert Friedman, number 313, Sonbyaku-son. One day in the coal mine, a Japanese came up to me and he said, I remember I learned to speak Japanese the hard way. But he came up to me and he said, Sonbyaku-son Judone. Now the number 10 in the Japanese language is Jew. And so when he said that to me and I translated it, he was saying, is number 313 10? You understand my thinking of it? No, he's not 10, no way. He kept asking that question from different people until he talked with another fellow that was working in the coal mine with me, and this young man didn't know anything about the Japanese language, understood nothing. So he did understand that he was asking about Sonbyaku-son, was he a Jew? And this young man said, yeah, Friedman's a Jew. And Friedman was taken out of line and beaten by the Japanese in the coal mine. Now these are civilians in the coal mine who then beat Friedman because he was a Jew. So we do know that there was a certain amount of the anti-Semitism even in Japan at that time. In prison camp, a perspective, we wanted to try to win the war. How could we in prison camp win the war against the Japanese? Well, number one, we were working in a coal mine. If you've never been in a coal mine before, which I don't imagine many of you have been, as you walk down this, and they never let us ride down, they made us walk down. And as we walked down this coal mine in the opening, there was a great big motor, and this motor was what ran the belt, and the belt is what brought the coal up the topside. One day we decided if we could stop that motor, we would be able to all get a rest, because you see, all the laterals shoveled coal into this main belt. If the main belt stopped, then all the laterals would stop working. So one day we made a deal. Number one man opened the oil reservoir. The next 10 men threw handfuls of rock into the oil reservoir. The last man locked the oil reservoir. And then we went to work. And 2 hours later, all hell broke loose. Obviously, the motor stopped, and along with it, the belt. So we ended up with 2 hours of rest while they tried to fix it. Our perspective. My dear wife, I want you to know, when people applaud me for being here, I want them to know that they have to applaud her, because she's put up with me for 46 years. And stand up, Betty Tenney. Now, people look at her and they say, she's so small. She claims that she was 6'2" when she married me. But don't let that get you. Not true. Well, my wife said to me, you know, certain things that you have to share with them that I did not put on my notes when she read my notes. Some of the things that perspective. So I'm sharing with you what the title is supposed to be. My point of view. How the devil do I get out of work in the coal mine? Let me explain this. This coal mine was 1.5 miles deep. We were in a coal mine that had been closed 2 years earlier because all the coal that was safe to take out had been taken out. And so we were there to strip the mine. It was very, very dangerous. We could go into the lateral today, and it would be 5 foot high, and we can leave the lateral this evening, and it would be 4 foot high to come down. And so the big question was, how do we get out of work? Well, the one way was to break a bone. Now, we never admitted this to a lot of people. We were a little afraid when we first came home. We didn't want to admit that we were breaking our bones and causing ourselves certain injuries on the ground that the VA wouldn't want to take care of us if it was self-inflicted, you know. So for the first 50 years, we denied it. You know, no, we didn't break our own bones, but we did. Typical bone broken is left hand. Why typical? Because most of us were right-handed, and we couldn't get a good smash with the left hand, so it was the right hand that smashed the left hand. Usually left legs that got broken, never the right leg. Usually left arms that got broken, never the left arm, never the right arm. And all because of our right-handedness. We used to make ulcers. We used to make ulcers on our legs, never on our arms, because on our legs it would mean that we couldn't put our shoes on, and we couldn't get to work in the coal mine. A good broken arm could be out of the coal mine for 2 days. A broken hand was out for 1 day. How did we break some of these things? We paid our buddies to break them for us. And what did we pay them with? Rations of rice. How did we get rations of rice? We traded cigarettes for them. And that's, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, that's how he became a professor of finance. It was very simple. All you had to do was understand the rule of supply and demand, which means that in prison camp, the only thing we had to trade was rice. We got 3 rations of rice a day, and every 20, 30, 40 days, we'd get a package of 10 cigarettes. Now, the philosophy was, on the day that cigarettes were issued, you could buy a ration of rice for 10 cigarettes. If you could wait about a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you could buy a ration of rice for 1 cigarette. Well, when I got my 10 cigarettes, I didn't smoke them, because smoking was smoking my food. I would save them for a couple of weeks, and then I could buy a ration of rice for 1 or 2 cigarettes. Then I would take the ration of rice that I would buy for 1 or 2 cigarettes, and I would trade it to somebody else. Rice today in the mess hall. Rice today for rice tomorrow. Rice today for rice Thursday. I would finally get somebody. I'd write down his name. Rice Thursday, then I'd get another ration. Rice today for rice Friday. I would keep trading until they would give me the rice, hoping that cigarettes were going to be issued that day. If cigarettes were issued, I would sell the rice for 10 cigarettes. Oh, became a professor of finance, all because of my time in prison camp. Well, my time is running short, and I know that they want to have some time for questions. So allow me just to finish by saying to you that today I am very friendly with Japanese people. I have been asked to go to Japan. I've been there, and I've lectured to 13 universities. I tell them the story exactly as I tell it here. I don't hide anything. The young people there want to know what happened. They are upset about what happened. The older people, meaning 45 and 50, those are what we call older, they never knew what happened during the war. When I gave these lectures to the students, the kids would come in and say, my grandpa wouldn't talk about it. No one wants to talk about it. I have some dear friends now in Japan. I go and I'm invited. The Japanese, some members of the university there transcribed my book, and it's now published in Japan in Japanese, and I was invited to the Japanese Diet to present my book to each member of the Japanese Diet. So I still have some friends there. I had a friend that came to live with me in San Diego 35, 37 years ago or more, and his name was Toru. He was a student. I have to just tell you this story. My son came home and he said, Les, we have a student that has lost his place to stay over the weekend. Could you keep him just for a couple of days? I said, sure. He said, well, I want to warn you, he's Japanese. I said, that's okay. Well, the Japanese student came in, and I greeted him in Japanese. And he looked at me and said, where did you learn Japanese? I said, I was a prisoner of war. He said, oh, my God, I won't be able to sleep good tonight. My wife said, it looks like you need a haircut. You want Les to give you one? He said, no. No. When I got through talking with him, he turned around to my wife. He said, "Don't learn Japanese from him." Where did I learn Japanese? From the coolies in the field and in the mine. I thank you very much for allowing me to share with you some ideas and hope that there'll be time for some questions. Thank you.
On your tie, yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to our three speakers for three very broad-ranging papers. One on the Holocaust as leitmotif of the 20th century, bringing the story really up to our own time, then the ubiquity of war crimes, Americans being involved in them too, by Jim Weingartner, and then a fascinating personal experience of one POW in World War II. Keep in mind that there was roughly 35 million people who were captured. And like Dr. Tenney, most of them spent more time in POW camps than they actually spent fighting in the field. That's often forgotten too. With that being said, the floor is open for questions. Sir.
Number one, thank you all for being here and sharing with us. Question for Dr. Tenney. With what you personally went through and saw and endured, I find it just, I don't know what the right term for it is, but phenomenally that you don't have any animosity towards your captors. Any way you can explain how you got through that?
I think that hating is a sickness. I cannot hate. I don't want people to hate me because I happen to be Jewish. I don't want to hate other people because they happen to be Japanese. I think hating is awful. I think when you've gone through what many of the POWs surviving come back, they are so darn happy to get back, they don't want to hate anybody. There are some, unfortunately, who are still hating the Japanese. I met them. I know a few of them. And what I say to these people, very simply, is you're still a capture of the Japanese. You're still a prisoner. You haven't given up being a prisoner yet. Because if you can't give up, then you're still captured. I gave it up.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have two questions, Dr. Tenney. One's a little bit along what Jim just asked. How did you work on yourself to get rid of the hatred? The second is, how did you become a professor of economics, or what did you do after you came back to the U.S.?
Wow, that's another 3-hour story.
Well, listen for a quickie.
I'll give it to you quick. Number one, I always had a goal. Even on the Bataan Death March, I always set short-term goals for myself. I would see a herd of caribou in the distance, and I would say, I must get to that herd of caribou. I didn't care what was going to be. I had to get there. Everything was dependent on getting to that herd of caribou. When I got to the herd of caribou, I would look down for something else, something else, something else, every 100 yards or a mile, until I kept it up, day after day, setting short-term goals. I never had a long-term goal, like I'm going to get home. That was too long. I had short-term goals. And that, I think, I had a very positive attitude. There was no question that I was coming home. I just didn't know when. How did my attitude, I can't tell you how I ended up having the attitude that I don't have any hatred. I just don't. I just am so happy with life. I just think it's so sad when people dislike other people. It just rubs me the wrong way. Now, how I became a professor, I spent the first year in a hospital. I got out of the hospital and I wanted to go back to school. I can honestly say that I'm a rare distinction of having my bachelor's degree just a year after I got my high school diploma, which means I didn't graduate high school before I went into service. But I came back and I registered at Northwestern University. And I was in my third year when they finally called me in and they said, "You are a liar. You told us you graduated high school and you never did." And I stood up in front of this dean and I took his desk and I threw it on top of him. And I said, "Don't you ever call me a liar." He said, "Well, you lied on your application." I said, "I did not. The application said high school last attended. And if you don't know how to speak English, you shouldn't be in the position you're in." He called in his secretary. He said, "I want to see his application." And sure enough, that's what it said on there. And he apologized. He let me stay in. But I had to go back and take some tests so that I would pass what they called high school. And I guess that's what became known now as a something else. But anyhow, I ended up getting my bachelor's degree, ended up getting my master's degree, and then I decided I wanted to be a professor and found out I had to get a doctor's degree. And I was willing to buy it any place they wanted to sell it. And I was teaching at San Diego State University when they told me I had to have a doctor's degree. So I went to USC, University of Southern California, Trojan. And I finally was admitted to the doctoral program, but I taught every day at San Diego State, and every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday I drove from San Diego to Los Angeles to take my courses. Monday, Wednesday, and I became known as the Rhodes Scholar. And I loved every minute of it. I loved what I was doing. I enjoyed doing what I was thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't have a question as much as an observation and some information. On May the 4th of 1945, my armored car, M8 armored car, happened to be named the Four Rebels. We entered and liberated Gunskirchen Lager concentration camp. This was a sub-camp of Mauthausen. There were about 18,000 inmates there with about 4,000 bodies. Now last May I went back over there for a memorial service, and along with 5 of us were 2 of the inmates that were in the camp when we liberated. Dr. Fish, Robert Fish, who is from Minneapolis, and Louis Kest. Now they had previously been in Mauthausen and had been transferred, actually walked, and many of them were killed on march from Mauthausen to Gunskirchen. In talking with Dr. Fish and Louis Kest to find out the standard procedure for the crematoriums at Mauthausen was to line the people up, shed them of all their clothing, and then to demonstrate the efficiency of the Germans, you might say, each of them was ordered to open their mouth. And if there's any gold, they painted a red cross on the back. Of course, they told them they were going in to take a shower. But the Germans knew that most of them would fall forward. So therefore, after they had gone down and given the gas, and there was a pile of 30 or 40 bodies, they didn't have to go look in each mouth, but only the ones with the red cross on the back to take the gold out. I really don't have the vocabulary to express all the sights I saw there at Gunskirchen. It's indescribable, really. A lady, Judita Harusa, who was in the camp, has written her memoirs and given me a copy and signed it, said that they were dying at the rate of 250 a day, said that she and her friend had solemnly agreed that they would not eat human flesh, although it was done fairly often there in the camp. A side aspect, our division made a booklet showing the pictures of Gunskirchen Lager. So if you'll go to Google and type in Mickey Dorsey and then Gunskirchen, you'll see the pictures of all the bodies. And at one ceremony, I was honored by the Jewish Council of California for my part in liberating. And last Veterans Day, not this one, last year, in New York, I was awarded this medal by the Israeli government. and I'm very proud and honored for what they've done for me. Thank you.
In listening to you gentlemen talking about the genocides in the 20th century, which is some incredible history about mankind, I think what we have to remember our own American history. In the miniseries that Ken Burns did on the Wild West a few years ago, in the California Gold Rush, around 1848, there was as big as a massacre of Indians in California. There were bounties by the miners and the pioneers in California mining for gold on Indian scalps. There was bounties on Indian heads. And this goes along with the genocides in this world, and our American history is all part of that, and we all have to look at the bigger picture, but we need to think of our history too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, this question is for Dr. Bartov. Would you address the world opinion of, I guess, countries' sovereignties regarding the genocides of Cambodia, Darfur now, and Sudan? It seems like the world knows this is going on, but they don't do anything about it. And similarly, maybe what happened in Germany occurred at the same time. The world may or may not have known, but they were powerless to do anything about it. Could you address that, please?
Yes, I can try. Obviously, is this working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is a very big question, so let me try to say something succinct about it. There is a general problem in international law in the relationship between the Genocide Convention of 1948 and conventions of conduct between states. The Genocide Convention, in fact, calls for, allows, and demands that the signatories of the convention do something in cases where they recognize genocide. And that can include also military intervention. However, states do not like the idea of intervening in the sovereign affairs of other countries, because that, of course, will impinge on their own sovereignty. This is why in Nuremberg in 1945, the entire process was structured in such a way that it was under the rubric of crimes against the peace. Crimes committed by Nazi Germany before the war broke out were not considered. This means that when states decide to intervene, say in the case of Darfur right now, they will have to intervene in the affairs of a sovereign state. If you send armies there without an international agreement on that, then you are going against another UN convention. So there is a structural tension between the Genocide Convention and all other conventions of international relations. Of course, ultimately, intervention comes or does not come because interests are involved. The United States did not go to war against Nazi Germany because of the Holocaust, because there was genocide of Jews or of anyone else. It went there because it believed, rightly, that this was in its own national interest to do so. The United States did not intervene in the case of the genocide in Cambodia because it had just been kicked out of that area, did not want to go back there, and no American administration would have had any public support from any part of the population for another intervention there. There is a very good book on that by Samantha Power called A Problem from Hell, which describes very well why the United States over the 20th century failed to intervene in cases of genocide because of primarily issues of national interest. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm done. Thanks.
The Nanjing massacre that took place in 1937 by the Japanese, there's been a movement, I think, a little bit by the Chinese government or the Chinese people to designate that as a genocide. What is your opinion on that?
Again, you know, this is my personal opinion is that this was not a genocide; it was a massacre. If you look at the definition of genocide according to the UN Convention, it could fall under genocide. I personally believe in a more restrictive definition of genocide than the one that has been adopted by the UN. I think it is good that we have a definition which is internationally agreed upon, but it is a very wide definition. I do not think that the Japanese had a policy of genocide in China to the extent that they did not want to eradicate the Chinese people. They did want to enslave them, they wanted to rule over them, but they did not want to eradicate them. And that, to me, is a fundamental difference. What happened in Nanjing was a war crime, a massacre, mass murder, but I don't think it falls under genocide.
Being Irish, I sometimes struggle with the euphemistic they. They did this and they did that. For example, was Joachim Piper, the architect of the Malmedy atrocity? Are there places in history where we can identify individuals who initiated genocidal tendencies? Are there places where we can identify characteristics of those who would begin crimes against humanity? I recognize this is a very broad question, but as I say, I struggle greatly against they.
Yes, there are many such cases. I mean, as you know, following World War II, there were multiple war crimes trials in which specific individuals were tried for specific crimes. Some of them certainly involved with genocide. Joachim Piper is an interesting case. He was tried by the United States and sentenced to death, although of course the death sentence was not executed, for this specific war crime, which I characterize as, I hate to use the term, but for want of a better word, a traditional battlefield war crime. But the interesting thing about Piper is that prior to actually assuming a field command, he had been Heinrich Himmler's adjutant. And as a matter of fact, had been, to use a lawyer's term, consensually present at least, while the Holocaust was being planned. And as a matter of fact, he even witnessed the gassing of some individuals. So his guilt really spanned these two categories of crimes that I was talking about, the big ideological crimes and the more or less commonplace battlefield crimes. But yeah, I mean, we can identify people like Piper. We can identify many others as well. For example, the commanders of some of the Einsatzgruppen who massacred vast numbers of Jews in Russia were brought to trial in one of the secondary Nuremberg trials.
Mr. Ollie Brown.
Dr. Weingardner,
Yes.
I wonder if you'd like to comment on the conduct of the Danish king and the Danish people as a kind of an unusual actions they took in regard to their Jewish colleagues and
Did you say Spanish?
Danish.
Oh, Danish. Well, of course, there was a very small. Okay, I see. Now I understand the question. Yes, I mean a wonderful example of people who assumed great collective risk to rescue their Jewish citizens from the Holocaust. And, you know, I think it's a reasonable point to make that the number of Jews who were killed in the Holocaust would have been substantially reduced if more Europeans had behaved in the way that the Danes did.
Sir. Dr. Weingard.
Yes.
Do you know what the survival rates were for Germans in Soviet camps and Soviets in German prisoner of war camps?
Well, the survival rates, of course, were low in both cases, but higher on the whole for Germans in Soviet captivity than for Russians in German captivity. The majority of Russians who were taken prisoner by the Germans did not survive the experience, in excess of 50%. As far as the Germans are concerned, I'm not sure that the figures are quite as clear, but it was lower than that, and what floats around in my mind is something on the order of a third, perhaps. But I suspect. Go ahead.
Let me chime in there a bit. Amongst Stalingrad prisoners, which of course was the first big German pocket taken by the Red Army, 90% died. That is, only 10% came back. But afterwards, the situation started to improve, and you have maybe death rates, mortality rates of 30% or so. Now, one of the ladies we had invited to be in the POW panel that didn't take place because of Katrina, Barbara Stelzel-Marx, a young researcher at the University of Graz, she has looked at an Austrian POW camp, or a POW camp inside the Ostmark in the area of Krems outside of Vienna. And she's done a very interesting study because that camp had Russian, French, and American flyer POWs. So you have really a very good case study of actually comparing mortality rates. The Soviet POWs were forced laborers to a large degree, and about 40% died. And the cruel fate was when they returned, very often they landed in camps because they'd been in the quote-unquote West too long. Amongst American POWs, I think only 3 or 4% died. Very low rate. Many of them were officers. They were not forced to go to work. So starkly different pictures in terms of POW treatment, very much along racial lines of German thinking. You know, the Americans, a bit closer to the Aryan Germans, were treated fairly well. The Geneva Convention was applied, but it was not applied to the Soviets. So really, immensely big differences in terms of mortality rates.
I remember having read a piece of indoctrination literature circulated among Waffen-SS units in 1944, defining Americans within Nazi racial categorization. And the definition was Americans are racial equals, but they have been led astray by Jewish materialism. So, in other words, their problems were not racial. Their problems were environmental, and therefore they, in theory at least, could be saved.
I think Professor Weinberg would like to add something to this, since he is in line 2 there. You mind if you give him the mic?
The statistics are very dramatic. In the First World War, 40% of German prisoners in Russia died or were killed. In the Second World War, the figure is 30 or 31%. In other words, 69 or 70% came home. For the Russian POWs in the First World War, somewhere around 5, 6, or 7% died. In the Second World War, 62%
were killed or died, the exact opposite of the figure for the German POWs in Russia. In one case, the overwhelming majority came home to very sad fate, as you indicated. In the other case, the vast majority didn't come home.
Thank you, Professor Weinberg. I'd like to ask the two who are in line to ask their questions because we have very little time left. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to ask Dr. Bartoff if he could comment on Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration's responsibility, if any, for the Holocaust and not acting sooner or more decisively.
Not a small question.
Yeah, that's well, look, the main issue, I would say, regarding American responses to what was happening in Europe already in the 1930s was highly restrictive immigration quotas, which were in fact never fulfilled, even those that were given.
During the war itself?
During the war,
I know we have limited time.
There are questions that have to do, should the Americans have bombed Auschwitz and so forth. Clearly, there were disagreements within the American administration as to how to respond to what was happening in Europe. But one has to say, as a general statement, that the United States was fighting a war against Germany and Japan. And so, to my mind, this kind of argument that the U.S. had a responsibility, there were things that could have been done that were not done. There were actions that could have been taken. But the major action, and this is how the administration presented it, was that they were fighting a war to finish off Nazi Germany, and that was the best way to stop also all the crimes being committed by the Third Reich. And generally speaking, that is true. The bombing of Auschwitz is such specifically, there have been many debates on that. It is clear that bombing railroads would have made no difference at all, because those were very easy to repair. The only way to act would have been to bomb the gassing facilities in Birkenau. Had that been done, had it been done in early summer 1944, when it was possible, the mass killing of Hungarian Jewry specifically would have not have gone as easily for the Germans. This was a very large population of over 400,000 people who were gassed that summer. Whether people knew that precisely at the time, that's another question. And whether then they would have bombed those facilities, I think that the evidence is not completely clear on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to ask this gentleman to come up and ask his question directly. We have a very tight schedule here. I would like to thank you for your attention and the panelists for their excellent presentations.